Hello, it's Bob here, and welcome back to another episode of the Undercurrent Stories podcast, where we dive deep into hidden depths of our world, one fascinating guest at a time. Today we're going to be exploring the science, the human stories behind something so familiar we scarcely think about it, and that's the weather forecast. Each day we glance at an app or hear a presenter tell us what the weather will do. But behind those brief predictions lies a vast and complex system of observation, modelling and communication, one that shapes our safety, our economies, and even our sense of the future. My guest is Thomas Webber, a journalist and author whose new book, Cloud Warriors, examines how meteorology has evolved. From the early warnings of tornadoes in America's Midwest to hyper-local forecasts now reaching farms in Ghana. We'll discuss how weather predictions have become dramatically more accurate, what that means for society, and how new technologies like AI may transform forecasting yet again. That's all to come as we look at the history, the science, and the human dimension of predicting the weather. Hello and welcome to the show, Tom.
Hey there, it's great to be here, Bob.
It's a really interesting book. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, I mean, I was having this discussion with somebody else, and I was saying, you read a book like this, which is, it is scientific, but it's not just scientific, as we'll come to. You know, you do the research for it and your years of experience, and then somebody like me can come along and learn so much in relatively short space of time. It's fantastic.
Oh, well, that's very kind of you to say, and obviously it means a lot when I hear that kind of feedback from readers, because that was my hope going into it, was to be able to demystify a realm of science that we all sort of turn to every day. I mean, everybody checks what the weather is going to be for the day, but we don't necessarily know everything that goes into that forecast and how good it is. So it's great to hear you say that.
I mean, obviously, we can't go right through the book in 45 minutes, but I will, as the episode progresses, I will sort of bring up some of the things like hurricanes, for example, and tornadoes, because there was stuff there that I'd never heard of, and I think this would find very interesting. But before we do that, Tom, could you just tell us a bit about yourself, please? Your growing up and becoming a journalist, and how you became interested in weather.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Michigan, outside of Detroit. And so I think, the main type of weather, or at least dangerous weather that, was common when I was growing up in, with people debate whether Michigan is part of the Midwest, but to me, it's part of the Midwest. Tornadoes were the danger. There'd be a tornado warning. You would hear the tornado sirens go off. I remember being in grade school and hearing being out on the playground and hearing the tornado sirens go off, and everybody, kind of being rushed inside to get into shelter. So I think that was the weather that was always foremost for me in terms of, worrying about my safety. I, in addition to being very interested in writing and journalism when I was in high school, was always just kind of interested in science and technology, particularly computers. And so after I graduated from college and I started working in journalism, in a fairly short order, I found myself working as a technology journalist at Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal. And I eventually became the Wall Street Journal's first internet columnist. This was in the 90s when everything about the internet was new. A lot of people had not been exposed to the internet. For readers of the journal, I think, the questions were, what does all this digital technology mean for me and my business, and the way consumers are going to change their behavior. And that really resonated for me as a journalist, because I was interested in science and technology, but I was also really interested in how science and technology have an impact on people and society. And that wound up kind of being my beat as a reporter and a columnist at the Wall Street Journal. I won't give you my whole life history, but I eventually kind of moved into management and editing at the Journal, I was a bureau chief, and at Time Magazine, I was the executive editor, which meant overseeing the cover stories and the major feature stories in the magazine. So I was away from doing my own reporting for quite a while, and then sort of hit a stage where I really missed the opportunity to get out and meet people and learn things for myself rather than going through the work of the people I was editing. And I had been interested in learning more about weather forecasting, and it was almost as simple as one morning just listening to the weather forecast and realizing that I always checked it every single day. It was a technology that was sort of integral to my life. And I realized I didn't really know all that much about where that information comes from. If you watch TV in the US, especially during hurricane season, you'll hear discussion of some of the computer models. And so, I had some understanding of, there's models that do forecasting and satellites and all of that. But I got curious enough to start really inquiring, where our forecasts come from. But also, I think the bigger question for me was, how good is a weather forecast, and are they getting better? And I guess given my reporting background, that inquiry felt very resonant to me from my days covering the internet, because just as I looked at the internet through that lens, I was looking at the science and technology of meteorology through that same lens of, okay, well, there's lots of interesting science and tech, but what does it really mean for people? What does it mean for society, and how do we put that to work? So that's kind of a long arc from being a kid on the playground with the tornado sirens going off to writing a book about weather forecasting. But that's kind of how I got there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And obviously the book is more, well, it's written from an American perspective. So you talk about some of the American meteorologists and stuff like that. But you have a lot of extreme weather in the US, but of course we're getting it here in the UK as well. And if we talk about climate change just for a second, and this isn't a podcast about climate change, whether you're a believer in man-made climate change or whether you are one of these people who sort of thinks, well, the world goes in cycles and it's going on a warmer one at the moment, or whether you're somewhere in between. I don't want to get into that polarized debate, but the facts are, and I was looking at some statistics this morning in the UK, and the data shows you quite clearly that from the beginning of the 20th century to now, it's warmer. The average mean temperatures are warmer. There's more extreme weather in terms of rainfall. So we've got it here as well. And you probably heard here in the UK, we've had quite a lot of flooding, particularly in the early months of the year. The summer we've just gone through, 2025, it's been a beautiful summer. But it's been quite hot as well. And you go into heat in one of your chapters in the book, which I found very interesting. But time and time again, there's some common denominators in the book which come up. And one is that if you are a fairly underprivileged person, and they tend to be on lower income, you suffer more as a result of extreme weather. And the other thing that came across, and it comes out in every chapter, and you mentioned it in the conclusion of the book, is that meteorology is getting better. We're able to get, and you'll obviously come into this in a minute and talk about it. So the science is getting better, but I think what I can gather, the industry's sort of woken up to the fact that they have to also be better at communicating that information to people in an effective way. Is that a reasonably good sort of conclusion of the book, do you think, Tom?
Very much so. And actually, I think, I remember pretty clearly the moment when that crystallized for me. I was in Norman, Oklahoma, at the National Severe Storms Laboratory, which is the main U.S. research facility for tornado weather. And if you've ever seen the movie Twister, or more recent one, Twisters. And NSSL is, it's sort of, it's home base for, for all things tornado. And, I spent a week there meeting with different scientists and going out on storm chases. But then I sat down with a woman who, instead of studying the physics of tornado formation or severe thunderstorms, focuses on sort of the sociology and the cultural anthropology of people who are impacted by severe weather. And there was an important project that was done at NSSL called Vortex Southeast, where after tornadoes in the southeastern U.S., all the weather scientists would go and they would look at the radar data, and they did all the usual things to try to understand what started the tornadoes and what drove their formation. But they also had teams of people go around and do interviews with the people who were affected and asking them questions like, when did you hear that there might be a tornado? When did you hear a warning? When you heard the warning, what did you decide to do? How did you make those decisions? And all of this kind of gets at this bigger question that people in the world of meteorology, I think, started really asking themselves seriously maybe 15 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly, but I think you can go back, maybe 15 or a few more than that, which is, hey, we keep improving our weather forecasts, but we're not always seeing great results from these improvements. So if the forecast is getting more accurate, why isn't that translating to fewer injuries and fewer deaths in some of these, extreme situations? And that really sparked this move to try to understand how people get their information about the weather and how they make those decisions. And I think also, started to highlight, as you mentioned earlier, that, in some cases there are some, societal inequities, whether that's, class or income. And some of those, correlate to, ethnicities and, other factors. And, that maybe to make that sound a little less abstract, but, a simple version of that is, okay, hey, here's a hurricane headed towards, say, Florida. You're somebody in Florida and you're being told that there's a hurricane on the way. If you are an information society remote worker who, spends your day on Zoom meetings, it's not that hard to pick up stakes and, maybe jump in your car and head to some relatives or a hotel a couple hours away and, keep on doing what you normally do for work.
Yeah.
If you are somebody who has a job, that requires a physical locality, a fast food worker, a landscape worker, not only can you not just pick up and, do that job elsewhere, but you're probably more in a situation where you're pretty concerned that if you don't show up for work, your job is in danger. I think, we can all understand that people in lower income and, those sorts of, hourly wage jobs, may well be more likely to fear that something bad is going to happen if they say, oh, I'm evacuating because of the hurricane. So that's one simple way in which that factors into people's safety for the weather. There's a lot of other. Heat is one dimension we could talk about, but I'll let you figure out where you want to go from there.
Yeah, I mean that's a great example there where you were talking about those people in society, and you make mention in the book about some of the homes that are constructed. They're not even tethered down to the ground, so no wonder they sort of blow off in a hurricane.
Yeah, that was in fact the that Vortex Southeast project that I mentioned, that was one of the sort of most important findings. Again, they were starting from a question of we see tornadoes in the southeastern U.S. and I know for you in the UK, tornadoes are a much not a completely rare phenomenon.
No, they're not. However, I did note in your book that the UK actually per square mile gets the most amount of tornadoes in the world.
Right, per square mile, but that's still not.
But they're very small
many tornadoes compared to compared to we get because of the geography. The geography of the continent. But so the Vortex Southeast people were asking themselves, not only are we seeing injuries and deaths from tornadoes in the Southeast, but it looks like they're disproportionate. It looks like for some reason the tornadoes are deadlier in some ways. And one of the conclusions after going around and doing these surveys and meeting people after tornadoes was the prevalence of I don't know the UK term. In the US we call them mobile homes.
Similar. Yeah, mobile homes.
The kind of prefabbed home that can be brought on a trailer and kind of set down on the ground. The industry here in the US has moved to the term manufactured homes, which I think is meant to sound a little more upscale than mobile home.
And we also say static caravans.
Caravans. I've watched enough British TV to at least know caravans as a term. But what they learned were so for income reasons, those types of homes are much less expensive than a traditional concrete foundation home with a basement, which has a lot more structural oomph to it. And in that part of the country, there's a fair number of people living in this type of inexpensive housing. That housing is riskier during a tornado. But what was most interesting that the researchers found was they would ask people, okay, well, what are you supposed to do if you hear that there's a tornado warning, if the sirens go off? And again, I was brought up with this information in Michigan. Every kid in elementary school learns it. You get inside, you go to the basement. If you are someplace where there isn't a basement, you get inside and you go to the most interior room. Ideally a bathroom, maybe you want to be far away from the windows, and you want to be in the part of the house that has kind of the strongest structure to it, which is in the interior. So they asked people in the Southeast this question: what are you supposed to do in a tornado? And everyone, for the most part, gave that answer, which is the correct answer unless you live in a mobile home. And then it's the absolute wrong answer, because there's no basement in a mobile home. And even if you get inside and go to an interior room, the structure just isn't strong enough because of that design relatively to a typical home. And so what you need to do if you're a resident in one of those homes is you need to get to a shelter. And increasingly, mobile home communities are being constructed with a specific shelter for that group of homes. But you may not have access to that. And so, if that's where you live, you need to be very aware that if there's tornado conditions, you need to be thinking about, how am I going to get to a shelter, in time if there's a tornado on the way.
And what would be the expected notice period for the authorities to sort of announce that there's going to be a tornado and you need to evacuate? How many minutes? How many hours?
So there's different answers to that question. I mean, the most dire indication of a tornado is a tornado warning, which gets issued by the National Weather Service, when they see actual rotation of air on their radar screen.
Could I just stop you there, please, Tom?
Yeah.
For those listeners, and I must admit, I wasn't totally au fait with it, but could you just explain what a tornado is, please?
A tornado is a fast rotating column of air. I'm not going to do justice to the process by which it forms, but in severe thunderstorms, because of temperature and pressure differences at different altitudes, you get a lot of movement, convective movement of air, and under certain conditions, you wind up with this sort of rotating tube of air, which, when it starts to tilt upwards towards the vertical, can sustain itself and keeps going. And so it's a fairly small but really intense phenomenon of spinning air that can, reach wind speeds of, 100 miles an hour or more. And, when that is close to the ground or touches the ground, it's incredibly destructive. And that's, again, the movie Twister does, better justice to that than, than I can, but you definitely don't want to be in its path. So, the Weather Service here will issue a warning for an area when they see on their radar screens the signature of rotating air. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's touched down somewhere, but that rotation is the thing that's indicative of a tornado forming or already formed. Okay, so when that type of warning goes out, typically you have 15 or 20 minutes at the outside between getting the warning and taking shelter before it's going to arrive in your location. So that's one answer, 15 to 20 minutes. That said, there's a whole spectrum of prediction and alerts that I hope people will be more aware of after reading my book. Now, the simplest one is, people in the U.S. would be reasonably familiar with what's called a tornado watch, which is short of a warning. It's usually issued a couple of hours in advance. And what it means is conditions seem ripe for tornadoes. So when you hear that there's a watch, that's your cue to kind of say, okay, I gotta keep my eyes open and keep my ears listening for news of a warning.
Have I got enough gas in the car? Have I got enough fuel in the car? That type of thing.
Right. And act if I hear that warning.
Yeah.
Okay. What's sort of amazing scientifically is even before watches, there's a group of the Weather Service called the Storm Prediction Center that uses computer modeling to look for areas of the country that are likely to have those tornado watch type conditions 2 and 3 days out. And they will put out this, it's not a watch, it's not a warning, it's an outlook that says there's an increased likelihood of severe weather. It's Monday. Wednesday, there's an increased likelihood of severe weather for this region of the country. Now, again, you get that information on Monday. You're not going to go spend the next 2 days in your basement shelter. No. But as with all types of dangerous weather, I think the principle that I'd love readers to understand is being aware of the conditions as they evolve. So sure, I hear this outlook. I don't head to the basement right away, but I do say to myself, well, where am I going to be Wednesday? Am I going to be someplace where it's going to be easy for me to get to a shelter if there is a tornado? Oh no, I'm supposed to play golf. That I don't actually play golf. I'm going to be out on the golf course on Wednesday afternoon. Okay, well maybe that's not such a great idea. Yeah. Or maybe at least Wednesday morning, I need to look at the forecast more closely and decide, do I really want to go out and play golf today? Again, this is a harder question for people whose jobs require them to be certain places. If you are a sales rep or a delivery person or, any number of jobs that require you to be out on the road, you may not be able to just cancel your plans, but you can look at them and say, okay, if I'm going to be in this location and I hear a tornado warning go off, what is my closest option? What is the nearest big structure? Where is someplace I can get to for safety?
Hi, it's Bob here. Just a quick interlude. Hope you're enjoying this episode. And if you would like to hear more interesting interviews, we have over 150 episodes to date with many fascinating guests talking about a wide variety of topics, which include music, history, philosophy, fitness, food and drink, adventure, contemporary culture, and many, many more. I'm sure there's something that you'd really enjoy. So all you need to do is just visit undercurrentstories.com or search Undercurrent Stories in any of the podcast platforms. And now back to the show. The other question I'd like to ask, really, and there's sort of two parts to this question. One is, I think we're in a situation now where it's generally accepted that weather forecasts are sort of better than they were 30 years ago. What has actually happened to make them so much better than what they were, would you say?
Well, they're definitely better over that time. If you look at sort of the typical, here in the US, a 5-day forecast is now as accurate pretty much as a 1-day forecast from 1980. And, I tried to express it this way. I was like, we can actually look 5 times further into the future, which, I'm just trying to get at some of the, something we take for granted is this, the weather forecast, but we're really looking into the future in an amazing way. So that's one example. Hurricane track projections, when you look at the map and it shows where the hurricane's heading, that track prediction has improved so much that when a hurricane is 72 hours away from landfall, the average error in terms of where it's actually going to hit these days is down to less than 100 miles, which is really powerful for helping people prepare. Okay, so how did we get better at this? Over the last couple of decades, it's been a result of steady improvements in computer modeling. Computer models take in all this information about the atmosphere. They take in information from weather satellites. They take in information from radars. They take in information from weather stations and weather balloon launches. And they take this picture of the atmosphere as it is. And, they crank the camera forward. They simulate the process of the atmosphere and tell us what things are likely to look like a couple of days down the road. So the computer models, they get better partly as scientists continue to, through their research, learn more about exactly the way the atmosphere works, right? So, they can, you can think of a sports video game, right? If you go back to when we were kids, a soccer game might, involve, a football game might involve.
We know what you mean.
might involve, like a couple of blocks on the screen and hitting a pixel, and the pixel kind of bounces, right? Well, as the computer processing and the software for simulating that behavior got more and more sophisticated, you can now look on your screen and, the computer player might be able to actually, bend the ball a little. They might be able to show it bouncing pretty realistically off another player, or, have some spin on it, right? So, the more sophisticated our software, the better the simulation is going to be. It's the same thing with weather. But also, as with computer games, the more sophisticated the software, the bigger and faster computer you need, right? You can't run, the FIFA football game from your PlayStation 5 on an old Atari 2600. It just won't work. So we've gotten better at computer models. We've gotten better at the computers that run the models. And critically, we've gotten better at inputting more data so that we have that accurate picture of the atmosphere. And so the latest generation of weather satellites, which provide critical data for this, one that I wrote about in the book that just amazed me was a lightning detector on the latest generation of weather satellites that watches from orbit. And even during the daytime, because it's using cameras with highly tuned wavelengths, it can spot lightning flashes during the day from above, map those into the computer, and lightning and the location and speed at which it is occurring gives critical indication of thunderstorm behavior and formation. So I put all of it down to better computers, better software in the sense of how good it is at simulating our Earth, and better data going in, which is all from radars and satellites, and really sort of amazing stuff.
That's how it's progressed over the years. I use a variety of weather apps, and I haven't got an iPhone, but I know iPhone got their own weather app as well. I use the Met Office, the British Met Office one, and sometimes Google. But they all vary slightly. And I would have expected them all to be, if it's going to rain, there's a 40% chance of rain. Why would one say 30, one would say 40, one would say 20? Why do they differ so much?
I don't use the Met Office app. I have to say, here in the U.S., the Weather Service does not actually have its own app for various arcane political reasons. I'll use the Apple weather app, but usually when I want to know the weather to some precision, I will do what the equivalent of using the Met Office app is, which is I will go onto the web and go directly to the National Weather Service site. And that's where you are seeing not only the output of these computer models, but what the expert meteorologists who interpret that information have looked at in the model and then sort of turned into the story of the forecast. And I suspect the app that you're using is doing much the same. They don't agree because everybody's model is a little bit different. I talk about a lot of the different models in the book. The one here that's used in the U.S. by the National Service primarily is called the GFS, the Global Forecast System. A lot of people would be familiar with the one that, I don't know, for shorthand, some people call it the Euro, but it's the one from the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts in Reading, which I spent some time at for my book, and there's some pretty important work that's going on there. The Met Office and the ECMWF have a very strong relationship, and time and again I would meet somebody at the ECMWF who had worked at the Met Office before. It
was interesting to see that when I was reading the book, obviously I was sort of stuck in America reading it until all of a sudden you opened the chapter up with Reading here in the UK with the EPCWMG, whatever it was. Which it was refreshing to hear that it not surprising, but we are sort of the UK's leading the way in terms of hurricane spotting.
Yeah, the models that come out of the ECMWF are, I think widely acknowledged to, be the gold standard for computer modeling. But maybe to turn that back to your question about why don't all the forecasts say the same thing? In a way, we don't want them to all say the same thing because, and people at the ECMWF or the Met Office would tell you this, when they want to predict the weather, they don't just take one model and look at the output from it and say, that's going to be the weather. At the ECMWF, they will take the model and they will run it dozens of times with little tweaks to the information going in. And the idea is, okay, you have all this data coming in about the atmosphere, but it's not perfect. The satellite measures from orbit that the air pressure at 10,000 feet is X at this location. Is it X plus 0.1%, minus 0.1%? I mean, those little variations can be meaningful. And so what the scientists have figured out to do over time is, instead of just running your model once, you vary all of the initial conditions slightly to kind of give you a way of representing the potential errors going in. And then you look at the output of all of these models. And sometimes the output all tracks each other very closely. And when that happens, you can say, okay, we have a lot of confidence in what this forecast is, because all of the models are agreeing. Other times, those pictures might diverge as they come out. And that's when people have, less confidence in the forecast. And that's when we say, like, it's uncertain. We're going to have to wait another day to see what, what things are looking like. So, 20% rain in one app, 30% rain in another app. I think a lot of that is down to just, exactly which model the app is drawing from. Interesting side note to me is, whether it's 20% or 30%, most people have a really hard time dealing with the information in that form, that percentage chance form. And I like to say, like, it's the same thing that keeps casinos in business, right? You hear 40% chance of rain, and you think, like, well, it's probably not going to rain. It's only 40% chance of rain. Well, that's, so there's a 60% chance it's not going to rain. That's pretty good, but I wouldn't necessarily put a lot of money down on it. People see in the app 20% chance of rain, and they go on with their day and they don't take an umbrella, and then it rains, and then they get upset and they say, oh, well, there they go, they were wrong again. They said it wasn't going to rain. No,
they didn't say that.
They said it was a 20% chance of rain. But
I'll hold my hand up. And I went to London yesterday, and we had a yellow warning for wind, and I think it was about 40 miles an hour. And it was a 40% chance of rain. So I thought, I'm probably going to take a coat with me. I'd probably take a coat. If it had been 20, I probably wouldn't have bothered. If it had been 80, then you'd be a fool not to, wouldn't you, really? But,
sure, absolutely.
40% with a yellow warning for wind, I'm going to take a coat.
Yeah, and that's, if we can all look at the forecast and accept that, it's not something that has 100% certainty, but is pretty good, especially when you factor in those probabilities. I think we can all apply them more effectively. Just as you did. If it says 40% chance of rain, and I take my umbrella with me and it doesn't rain, I'm not going to, I don't get upset afterwards. I feel good that I would have been prepared. If something happened. When it comes to much more dangerous things, like, there's a chance of flash flood. That's something where your safety could be at stake. And so, I don't think you want to just wave that off and say, oh, well, 30% chance, I don't need to worry. I think you hear 30% chance and you say to yourself, okay, where am I going to be? Am I going to be in danger if a flood does arrive? And how would I make sure to keep myself safe?
Yeah. One chapter I found very interesting, I think it was the second chapter, was all about heat. And some people would say, well, is that weather? Well, yeah, it is. And the main issue is, of course, wildfires. But also, people who are having to accept heat in their environment for some reason because they haven't got air conditioning, or they perhaps haven't taken much notice of it. But if we could talk about wildfires for a minute, I was quite interested to see that one of the weather not so much companies, but the people that were doing the studying of it were from an electricity and gas company.
Yeah,
and I had to, sorry to interrupt, and I had to say, well, why would they do that? And of course, then it became evident. Perhaps you'd just like to tell listeners about that, because it's quite interesting.
Sure. I devoted a whole chapter to wildfires for the reason you're describing. And wildfires themselves may not actually be weather, but their formation and their spread are intimately tied to the weather. You need the right weather conditions for a wildfire to form, and you need the right weather conditions for a wildfire to spread. But one of the reasons I became so interested in wildfire weather forecasting was, as you described, it is something that isn't just the province of the government forecasters that we think of. I went to Southern California in San Diego, where the weather prediction is being handled in different ways by different organizations and agencies. And in one of them is the National Weather Service. And I went to the National Weather Service office in San Diego, which has an amazing view of the mountains to the east. And, they do the sort of everyday weather prediction. But then I went to the electric utility, San Diego Gas and Electric, SDG&E, and they have an in-house meteorology department. They have a gentleman who is essentially their chief forecaster. He's an expert meteorologist. They have their own network of weather stations spread across the area where their customers for their electric utility are located. They have cameras watching all of these areas, and they even have their own computer forecast model that, just like the big ones we were talking about a moment ago, dedicated to figuring out where the hurricane is going to go. These are focused, and much more finely tuned on this small area of Southern California and the winds in the hills and the valleys to understand what those weather conditions are going to be like. And the reason that electric utility is so focused on this is that some of our deadliest wildfires, some of our biggest disasters have been traced back to sparks from electric lines during dry and windy weather. PG&E, further up the coast in California, was found, responsible in the event of one of these fires, and it, was traced back to wind and sparking onto vegetation below that, sort of exploded into a wildfire. So this utility, SDG&E, they figured out not only is it, helpful to know when the weather might be coming that's going to be dry and windy, but they also figured out they can make plans to activate when they get this information. So a few days out of windy, dry weather, they will do things like have crews go out and inspect where the big electric lines are, and they'll look for loose brush, and they'll pick up the brush, or they'll cut down the brush. They'll look for branches that might be near a power line and that could be blown into the power line if the winds pick up, and they'll cut down that branch. The closer you get to the dangerous weather, they may take more drastic steps. Living on the East Coast of the U.S. here in New York City, I don't really have much experience with this, but my friends on the West Coast are pretty familiar with these power shutoffs. They're called public safety power shutoffs, and if wildfire conditions, are deemed dangerous enough, the electric utility may actually shut off service to a limited area for a limited time to eliminate the danger from those lines sparking and causing a wildfire. Well, the better your weather prediction, the more information you have about, maybe we don't need to take that step, or maybe we can limit that step to a much smaller area. So the whole area of Southern California was very interesting to me because of the kind of the cooperation and the segmentation between what was happening at a private company, the electric utility, and what was happening at the government, which was the Weather Service, but also the firefighting organization in California, Cal Fire. When the fire starts, they need to know which way it's going to go. They need to know where to station their fire crews. And so they have their own separate weather forecasting system that is tailored to answering those questions, right? And in some ways it might, to your listeners, sound redundant, but I think you have to think of it as, different tools in your toolbox, or different clubs in your bag. If you're playing golf, the Weather Service needs what's, essentially a driver, they're taking the big swings for the whole area of Southern California. The electric utility is focused on a much smaller area. They need the 9-iron. They need the precise, smaller shot. The same thing, for the firefighters, they need a different tool for that job. So it's just really amazing integration between some of this.
I found that very interesting. The other chapter I found very interesting was where you talked about what you describe as hyper-local weather. I found that particularly fascinating. And there's a story that you've got about, I'm just getting my notes here, the lady called Mary Okanbia, who was a farmer in Ghana, and how she increased her yields. Could you just tell listeners that little story? Because I thought it was absolutely incredible. Sure, a direct result of hyperlocal weather forecasting.
So hyperlocal weather forecasting just refers to, having your forecast focus on a much smaller area than you would think otherwise. In New York City, I usually get the forecast for New York City. Upstate New York, I'll get the forecast for the Hudson Valley. A hyperlocal forecast for where I live would translate to maybe the 10 block area where I live in New York City, versus the 10 blocks further south than that. And this is really an emerging technology, and one that in some ways is embryonic because it takes a lot of local data and it takes a lot of extra computing power. We were talking about all the computing power in those models earlier. You're applying it just for a small area. So, you can't really do that in every single area, across across a continent, at least not yet. But the example that you're describing, I talked with a company that is providing some of these hyperlocal forecasts to farmers in Ghana in cooperation with the government. And what's interesting about these forecasts is they are very simple, right? I mean, we look at our smartphone and we're used to seeing, here's an icon of a cloud and it says 30% chance of rain, and maybe you click in and there's a whole chart, whatever. What they figured out for the people who could put this information to the best use, these individual farmers in Ghana, they didn't need all that, and many of them don't have smartphones. Many of them have, older technology, flip phone type of, phone that can get an SMS text message but can't display some elaborate map. And so the forecast information they get sent is, for their area, rain tomorrow or dry tomorrow. And, sort of most helpful for these people, they combine that forecast information with some basic agricultural guidance. And I did not grow up on a farm, so a lot of this was new to me. But I learned in talking with these folks that You don't want to put your fertilizer down right before it rains, because the rains will just wash the fertilizer away, and fertilizer costs money, and you will have wasted the money on your fertilizer. If you are a small family farmer, that is a significant impact on your finances if your fertilizer goes to waste there. So the hyperlocal forecasting that these farmers are receiving through their phones, it's very basic like that. It's like, tomorrow is a good day to plant. Yeah. Tomorrow is a bad day to fertilize. Get prepared to harvest. And it's that combination of a weather forecast and good agronomic practices. And the woman that you're describing in the book, she was really one of the favorite people I wound up talking to in all of my research, and I had to talk with her through an interpreter over Zoom. My travel budget did not extend to Ghana, for that chapter. But what she explained to me was that, she wasn't sure that she believed in this, kind of like, all right, I'm going to get this message on my cell phone and I should do what it says. And especially, if you've grown up in a farming area and probably, your parents did farming, maybe your grandparents did farming, a lot of that information gets passed down through the family, and it's almost sort of cultural lore versus, actual, scientific information. So this woman, Mary, she said, I'm curious, is this really going to be better? And so she has, a couple of acres of land that she's farming. And when they told her that she would start getting these text messages, she set aside one part of her land where she was growing corn to follow the instructions that she was getting from the forecast. And she set a small area aside to do what she would traditionally do based on, her own experience with the weather and, maybe what she learned from her family and from her neighbors. And, so she conducted her own little experiment, and she found in the end that following the scientific forecast information gave her, tremendously better yield of corn from the land. And I don't remember the numbers offhand, but I have them in the book. I mean,
I think it was almost double, Tom. I read it fairly recently. So
and also, not only does it, I think I can find it here. Not only does it increase her yield, but that really has a direct impact on her family, her family finances. So on the so she nearly doubled her yield, and that was an extra $200 of revenue before her costs, which in the economy of
I thought it was a lovely story, Tom, and just shows what good weather forecasting can do.
Well, and really, like as we were talking about at the beginning, it's like, why was I interested in weather? Partly because I'm a science and tech geek, and I love seeing weather satellites and radar technology and computers, but I also want to understand what they mean for people. And I'm glad you brought up this particular story, because I'm not sure there's a better example in the entire book of how taking that information and putting it in the hands of people in a way they can use, can really be life-changing for the better.
How do you see? I mean, we mentioned we've touched briefly on AI. So it's a bit of a sort of a question that I already half know the answer, but how do you see weather forecasting develop in the next 10 years?
AI promises to be a tremendous part of weather forecasting in the next 10 years. I spent quite a bit of time talking with the people in Reading at the ECMWF about AI, and it was interesting because during the time that I was there, it was literally evolving. It's changing at a speed that is so great that even over the days that I was there and sort of the months that I was following up with them afterwards, their use of it and the extent to which they were rolling it out was already changing. The same thing is true here in the U.S. And the great promise of AI in weather forecasting is that you can get the same type of information that you get from the traditional computer model, but you can get it much faster and more cheaply. Basically the traditional weather model, you put in all this information about the atmosphere and it grinds through second by second and says, okay, if this hot air is next to this cold air at this location, 5 minutes from now, what is that air going to look like? What will have moved where? What will it be doing? And it does this over and over and over again, to produce this picture of the future looking further out. AI doesn't really do that. It just kind of takes a shortcut. It looks at what you put in and it says, oh, based on everything that everybody fed into me from the past, if it looks like this now, in a couple days, it's probably going to look like that instead. And so people are very excited because improving weather forecasting has sort of meant building progressively more powerful and more expensive supercomputers every couple of years. In Reading, I was struck to see just this room filled with supercomputers that had already basically become, not obsolete. They're still using them, but they are not the very top of the line used for their most critical forecasting. They had already replaced these, in a matter of years. So AI has this promise of being able to do the same type of forecasting with less expense and also at a much faster speed. The computer doesn't crank through each of those 1 second from now, 5 minutes from now, 10 minutes from now. You just, you put it in and you get it out. Now, all of that said, as with everything in AI, there's a problem, which is when you get your answer out of the AI, you aren't exactly sure how the AI came to that conclusion, right? And as if any of us are fooling around with Chat GPT or Copilot or any of the things that are kind of available to us, we've probably all had the experience at least once of getting kind of a wacky answer to a question and wondering like what would make it say that. Well, that's something we really want to avoid in weather forecasting. So I think there's all this excitement about adding this really powerful new tool to the toolbox. At the same time, I think there's some concern that in the name of budget cutting or saving money, people who maybe are involved in the budget process but don't really know that much about the science and technology will be tempted to say like, well, now we can do away with all of this, all of this tedious work that you all were doing on simulating the atmosphere, or this research project that, examines all the radar data from tornadoes to try to figure out, when a tornado will form. We'll just let the AI handle it, and we can get rid of these people, and we can save a lot of money. I think that's a very real fear, especially here in the U.S., where we've seen really aggressive attempts to cut the size of the budget. So I'm very excited because I think there's enormous potential. But I think almost everyone that I talk to in meteorology wants to roll it out in a way that we get to learn as we go. I guess, maybe think of it as the air traffic control system, right? Which right now is primarily humans looking at screens and making decisions about the information they see. Probably there's potential for AI to be really helpful in aiding that process. Yeah. But I don't think any of us would want to get on an airplane tomorrow if you were being told, as of tomorrow, we're just turning the whole thing over to the AI.
I think what you're saying is it's keep it running parallel with all the other tools that you've got, and use it. And like you say, when you put all those different, the parallel would be, or the analogy would be, all those different weather forecasts you get, a TV station might put them all together and come up with their own slant on it.
Right, and it's something that can give us more confidence in the forecast that we already saw, or could cause us to re-examine what the traditional forecast is telling us. But it's an additional tool, but not a replacement.
If we had and I'll include yourself in this, Tom, if we had 10 top meteorologists in the meeting today, and they had the opportunity to tell the listeners of this podcast something about weather, what do you think they'd say to them?
One thing I think they would say is that the weather forecast is better than you probably think. I met a bunch of young meteorology students as part of my research for this book. And to a person, they expressed this exasperation that their friends who knew they were studying meteorology, their families, kind of would hang on to this cliche of the weather forecaster is never right. And the facts don't bear that out. There's a perception that comes, as we discussed earlier, from forecasts that have probabilities attached. I can tell you that you have a 60% chance of winning your blackjack hand, but that's a 40% chance that you're going to lose your blackjack hand. You can't take that information and then blame the probabilities when you lose your money there. So I think one thing meteorologists would want people to know is how good forecasts have gotten and how important that is. And it's driving things like during hurricane season, being able to alert areas to prepare, move supplies into place. One thing, I don't know if this would be familiar this might be a very U.S. phenomenon, but you will see if you are on a highway in the days before a hurricane is headed to the southern U.S. Up here, you might see a caravan of electric utility trucks headed south, because the utilities all cooperate with each other. And when they think there's going to be a lot of power lines down in the south, the companies in the north will send their trucks down there to help prepare. And so, that information that helps us get ready earlier is really valuable. And, with hurricanes, we've really seen the power of that bear out.
Yeah.
I think these same meteorologists would also say, these great forecasts are only valuable if people know how to put them to work and pay attention to them. And one of the most sobering parts of my research was going back and reading through these chronicles of tornado disasters with interviews. And there's one I describe in the book where they talked to this guy, and fortunately he was okay after the tornado, but other people had died. And he heard the tornado siren go off, and he continued on his way and went to a restaurant because he was hungry and wanted a meal. And then he got inside, and everyone in the restaurant was, there's a tornado. And I think I may not be remembering the details accurately at this point, but he wound up leaving this restaurant, and the tornado sirens are still going off. And he drove to another restaurant that was closed because of the tornado warning. And then he drove to, it's like, tornado be damned. I want my lunch. We all need to take responsibility for paying attention to these forecasts and thinking about how to be safe. And we also need to, I really believe we need to take responsibility for understanding that some people are vulnerable and may not be able to take care of themselves in that situation. And I know earlier I mentioned the example of, people who may not want to evacuate because they're worried about losing their jobs. But in the example of heat waves that you mentioned before, the vulnerable people look different. They may be elderly people who don't have air conditioning in their home, but because they are older, their bodies are more susceptible to the danger of high heat. They may not want to leave their home and go to an evacuation center with air conditioning. They may need encouragement. They may need a friend to say, come stay with me. But we have to recognize that in each of these types of weather, there are vulnerable people who may need our help. And so I think meteorologists would also say, let's celebrate the improvements in our forecasts, but also let's all look for ways to make sure that we can use them to help people stay safer.
Well, I think that's a great summary to our conversation, Tom. It's been a really interesting conversation, really fascinating. And I can thoroughly recommend the book. It really was a great insight for me. And I think anybody who reads it will enjoy it.
Well, thanks so much. Those are very kind words. I appreciate that. And, like I said, my hope is that people can take this and, every day they listen to the weather forecast, but do they really know where it comes from? Yeah. So, I hope it's worthwhile for people to read the book and really learn where that information comes from and how they can put it to better use.
Well, we'll put all the links to the book on the show notes. Thank you ever so much for coming on the show, Tom.
Yeah, great talking with you, and apologies for any failure to translate my U.S. examples.
No, there was hardly anything there. I think most English people know.